The case of Nicholas Barclay is one of the most perplexing and tragic missing persons cases in modern history. A troubled teenager from San Antonio, Texas, Nicholas disappeared without a trace in 1994. What followed was a bizarre series of events that involved an imposter, a shattered family, and lingering questions about Barclay's fate. Nicholas Patrick Barclay, more commonly known as Nicky, was born on December 31st, 1980, and grew up in a somewhat turbulent household. He lived with his mother, Beverly Dollarhide, who struggled with heroin addiction, and his older siblings, sister Carrie and brother Jason, the latter of whom played a significant role in the events that unfolded after Nicholas's disappearance. According to Nicky's sister Carrie, their mother Beverly was not a bad parent despite her substance abuse issues. Quote, "She was maybe the most functioning drug addict. We had nice things, a nice place, never went without food." Described as a rebellious and difficult child, Nicholas had a history of behavioural issues. He frequently argued with his family, skipped school, and had multiple run-ins with law enforcement. According to his mother, who worked night shift at a donut shop at the time, the teen even occasionally struck her and would curse at her, their arguments getting so out of hand that on some occasions the police had to be called to their residence. Jason allegedly moved into the Barclays' residence in order to keep a watchful eye on his troublesome younger brother. At the time of his disappearance, Nicky was facing legal trouble that could have placed him in a juvenile detention centre. He had a court hearing scheduled the day after he vanished in regards to breaking into a convenience store, stealing a pair of shoes, and threatening a teacher, which initially led some to believe he had run away to avoid punishment. One of the punishments offered was being sent to a group home, something Nicholas strongly opposed. However, as time passed, with no sign of Nicky, his family and authorities grew increasingly concerned that something more sinister had happened to him. On June 13th, 1994, Nicky was last seen playing basketball with his friends near his home in San Antonio, Texas. He called home later that day, asking his mother for a ride, but his older brother Jason refused to wake her up. Nicholas never returned home, and this was the last confirmed contact anyone had with the 13-year-old. At first, his family assumed he had run away, given his troubled past. He had disappeared before, but always returned within 24 hours. However, as days turned into weeks with no sign of him, suspicions arose. The situation became even stranger when, 3 months after his disappearance, Jason claimed to have seen Nicky trying to break in to the family's garage late at night on September 25th, 1994. Jason said that before he could reach Nicky, the boy fled the scene. This sighting was never confirmed by anyone else, and police were unable to locate Nicky within the vicinity. Many were left skeptical as to whether this sighting had any credence to it. Authorities found it unusual that Barclay had not contacted his family or used his social security number, his credit cards, or identification in any way. While law enforcement continued to classify him as a runaway, theories of foul play began to emerge. In October of 1997, a young man living in a youth shelter in Linares, Spain, contacted the authorities, claiming that Nicholas Barclay was at the shelter. The boy told a harrowing story. He said he had been kidnapped, taken to Europe, and subjected to years of abuse at the hands of a child sex ring operation. He claimed that Nicholas's captors had altered his eye colour with chemicals and manipulated his appearance. His accent and European phrasing, he explained, had changed due to years of being forced to speak only the French language. Barclay's family was understandably desperate for closure and wanted to believe that their missing son had finally been found. Despite inconsistencies, such as the fact the young man had dark hair and brown eyes instead of Nicholas's light brown hair and blue eyes, the family welcomed him home. Nicky's sister flew to Spain, identified the man as her brother, and brought him back to Texas. The man referred to Carrie by name, rather than what Nicky used to call her, which was always Sis. This was unusual, but his story was convincing. He knew so many details about their family, and even shared the same tattoos as Nicky. How could it not be him? Carrie later said of the ordeal, quote, "Your heart takes over, and you want to believe." Even though Barclay's closest family welcomed him home with open arms, other family members were less enthusiastic, finding it difficult to believe that this individual was Nicky. There were suspicions of the man's story from the get-go, and they were right to feel this way. Reporters who covered the story after the man who claimed to be Nicholas returned to the States were also very sceptical. One even noticed how the man's ears did not match Nicky's, noting that human ears are almost as unique as our fingerprints. They were similar, but not a match. A private investigator asked a number of ophthalmologists if chemicals could change a person's eye colour, to which the man claimed, to which they said it was not possible. Things weren't adding up, and something was awry. As time went on, the man struggled to keep up the charade. He was finding himself falling out of character and started acting irrationally. His act had consumed him, so much so that he could no longer recognise himself. One day, the man grabbed a razor and mutilated his face, resulting in him being sent to a psychiatric facility for treatment before being released back to the Barclay family. Speaking of the incident, the man later wrote in a notebook, quote, "When you fight monsters, be careful that in the process, you do not become one." The man refused to give blood samples or fingerprints to authorities to confirm his identity, which raised even further suspicions that he was not who he claimed to be. He also refused to identify who had abducted him back in 1994. In February of 1998, the FBI managed to obtain a court order to take the man's blood and fingerprints to compare to missing Nicholas Barclay, and the results left everyone stunned. In truth, the young man claiming to be Nicholas Barclay was not him at all. He was Frédéric Pierre Bourdin, a 23-year-old Frenchman known as the Chameleon for his history of impersonating missing children. He was an imposter. Bourdin had a long history of assuming false identities. Before posing as Nicholas, he had impersonated over 500 missing children worldwide. He held many aliases, was highly skilled at deception, using fake stories, mannerisms, and psychological manipulation to convince families and authorities of his lies. He was a master of disguise, ever changing his physical appearance and the way he presented himself, even down to the way he walked. Notably, Nicholas Barclay wasn't the only missing child Bourdin had claimed to be. He had also impersonated missing 6-year-old French boy Léo Ballet, who vanished from the Taillefer Mountains in July of 1996. He claimed to be Leo in 2004, when he would have been approximately 14 years of age. He also created multiple young teen personas, including a boy named Ruben Sanchez Espinoza, who claimed his mother was killed in the Madrid bombing attacks, and Francisco Hernandez Fernandez, a 15-year-old orphan whose parents were killed in a car accident. He was exposed after a school administrator told the principal that they recognised Bourdin from a documentary about a serial imposter. He even took on more elaborate personas, including a tiger tamer and a priest, but a recurring theme continued throughout. Each persona had been an abused or abandoned child. He managed to access youth shelters, orphanages, schools, and even children's hospitals without question, disguising himself impeccably. His cons took him all over the world, including the likes of Spain, Germany, Belgium, France, Denmark, Switzerland, and of course the US, to name a few. Even though some believed Bourdain carried out these impersonations for some sort of gratification or gain, a prosecutor in France determined he carried out his actions purely for emotional gain, not sexual, not financial. His penchant for telling tales began when he was at school, telling his classmates elaborate stories about his father, who was a British secret agent. In reality, he did not know who his father was. As his love for attention grew, his lies began to spiral out of control. He often feigned amnesia and created characters that were mute or wandered the streets aimlessly until someone came to his aid. He even latterly faked his own death, claiming to the mayor of his hometown that he had died in Munich, in Germany, but his body never returned to France, raising suspicions. His mother knew her son had played another one of his sadistic and twisted mind games. His actions as a youth had severe repercussions, which resulted in Bourdain ending up in juvenile detention when he was just 12 years old, a year younger than Nicholas Barclay was when he vanished. When Bourdain latterly arrived in Texas, he lived with Nicholas's family for several months, during which time he attended school, interacted with neighbours, and even gave interviews as Nicholas. His unusual behaviour and obvious differences from the missing boy, such as his thick French accent, eventually raised further suspicions. On March the 5th of 1998, Nicky's mother, Beverly, contacted a private investigator, telling him that she no longer believed the man to be her son, but an imposter. The following day, the private investigator, Charlie Parker, met the man at a diner where he confessed that his name was in fact Frederick Bourdain. After getting a warrant from Interpol, Bourdain was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison for passport fraud and perjury. This sentence was unusually harsh compared to typical cases of identity fraud, reflecting the emotional damage he had inflicted on Barclay's already struggling family. Bourdain was aptly described by Jack Stick, the prosecutor in the case, as, quote, flesh-eating bacteria, and compared his heinous actions of shattering hope of a grieving family to that of a murder. Bourdain had made several conflicting statements about Nicholas over time. At different times he claimed he had known Nicholas in Spain and that the boy was still alive. He then said he had proof that Nicholas was deceased. He also claimed he had never actually met Nicholas and knew nothing about his case. These contradictions only deepened the mystery surrounding Nicky's fate. Some theorists believe that Jason, either alone or with others, was involved in Nicky's disappearance and that his sudden overdose was not a coincidence. Others argue that Nicholas was simply a runaway who never wanted to be found. Despite his story changing multiple times in regards to knowing or not knowing who Nicholas was or what happened to him, Bourdain did finally admit that he posed as the missing youngster after seeing his missing persons poster. Following the devastating revelation that Bourdain was in fact not Nicky, the focus shifted back to Barclay's original disappearance. Police began investigating his family further, particularly his mother and brother, for possible involvement. Beverly Dollarhide, Nicholas's mother, had been addicted to heroin at the time, but had entered recovery afterwards. She took 2 polygraph tests regarding her son's disappearance, passing one but failing the second. Meanwhile, Jason, who had previously reported seeing his brother after he vanished, became a person of interest. Jason had developed a severe drug problem following Nikki's disappearance, carrying guilt for not giving his brother a lift home that day. His behaviour became increasingly erratic, and some believed he knew more about Nikki's fate than he had admitted. However, before police could question him any further, despite being a year sober, Jason died of a cocaine overdose in 1998. With his death, the investigation into Nikki's disappearance hit yet another dead end. Despite extensive investigations, no definitive evidence has ever surfaced to confirm what happened to Nikki. To this day, he has never been found. His case remains open, with authorities still receiving occasional tips. Some believe he may still be alive and living under a different identity. Others fear that foul play took his life many years ago. While many agencies still classify Nicholas as a runaway, the possibility of murder has not been ruled out. Bourdain's involvement in the case, while disturbing, ultimately distracted from the real issue: what happened to Nikki? Nobody has ever been charged in relation to his disappearance. There were no witnesses and no evidence to indicate what fate befell him. It is unknown if Nikki is alive or deceased. Decades after his disappearance, Nikki's story remains one of the most bizarre and tragic missing persons cases in US history, marked by deception, loss, and lingering uncertainty. Until new evidence or witness testimony emerges, the mystery of Nicky Barclay's disappearance sadly remains unsolved. At the time of his disappearance, Nicholas Patrick Barclay, known as Nicky, was 13 years old. He is described as Caucasian, with light brown hair and blue eyes, standing at 4 feet 8 inches tall and weighing approximately 80 pounds. He notably had a number of tattoos, including the letter J on his left shoulder, the letter T on his left hand between his thumb and forefinger, and the letters L and N on his outer left ankle. He also had a gap between his front teeth. On the day he vanished, Nicky was wearing a white t-shirt, a pair of purple trousers, and a pair of black shoes. He was also in possession of a pink-coloured backpack. Due to the circumstances involved, Nicky's case is classed as endangered missing. If alive today, he would be 44 years old. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Nicholas Barclay, you are urged to contact San Antonio Police Department at 210-207-7484.